Welcome to the Think Forward Show. Let's explore the future together.
Welcome, friends and fellow big thinkers. We're diving deep into the future of democracy and governance with a visionary who lives at the intersection of futures thinking, political systems design, and experiential futures. He brings a fascinating background in anthropology, visual media, and future studies to his work at the Institute for the Future's Governance Futures Lab. In this conversation, we'll explore how governments can better prepare for radical change, why our current systems may not be equipped for 21st century challenges, and how experiential futures can help us feel and understand possible tomorrows in ways reports and white papers simply can't. From pandemic simulations for the CDC to redesigning Hawaii's future through immersive experiences, his work challenges us to think differently about governance, not just tweaking what exists, but fundamentally reimagining what's possible. So buckle up for a journey through constitutional conventions, governance laboratories, and the powerful ways in which we can make the future tangible today. Welcome to episode 130, The Futures of Democracy, with Jake Dunagan. Jake, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Well, you and I have known each other for a long time, and I know a lot of people who are in the futures field familiar with you for many different things in governance and experiential. But for those who don't know you, let's kind of start with your background, your journey.
Okay. Yeah. It's always the determination of whether to take the long road or the short road. I'll try to do an efficient road, and then we can just name a few milestones along the way, and then we can pick up some of those themes as we go. But I think it's relevant. I grew up in Alabama, outside of Birmingham, so not the most oriented place or culture. And I appreciate it. I have no ill will to it. But it was a lot of backward looking, to be honest, in the past, sort of, thinking about that. And I sort of always yearned for the future and tried to look, at what's next. And so, coming out of that, my intellectual background started in anthropology. And so I was, very attracted to why people do what they do. I mean, really fundamental questions. Like, why does this group of people eat this food and pray to this God, and this other group that's, their neighboring culture do something totally different? I'm just fascinated by that. Why do people do what they do as a fundamental question that's run throughout all of my work? So I, really like that holistic thinking, the kind of thick description, I guess, is a term of ethnography, like looking at the details, really honing in the material culture, why people believe what they do, beliefs that are embedded in material culture. Those were kind of fascinating elements of anthropology. And that kind of evolved toward anthropology of media as I went along. Really, really also fascinated in a similar way why people or how people represent themselves, what they create visually, and then how does, in a sense, a more meta conversation around how do you represent a culture accurately or fairly or, rigorously and usefully. And that sort of got me into the sort of media visual anthropology sphere. And I was really fascinated at that point by questions of how is truth created? How does representation work? What happens when we look at other cultures, and how to create meaning within, a genre, for example, of documentary film or ethnographic film. I really had not thought about futures very much. Part of my origin story is that I started a bookstore as an undergrad, and boxes of books would often sort of show up on our doorstep from professors that wanted to get rid of them. And in one of those boxes was a book called Quantum Politics. It was actually a manuscript. It was like, pre-publication manuscript. And I, looked at that and started reading that. And that was a series of thought experiments about redesigning the U.S. Constitution based on quantum physics rather than Newtonian physics. So not a mechanical world of balance of power and separation and sort of individually bounded political subjects, but really what happens when we influence reality, or that that things are less certain, and that certainty and predictability are fugitive. And how would you design a political system around that? So that was kind of a lurking thing that really sparked my interest. And in the meantime, I'm going on spending years in anthropology. But after my master's in anthropology, I went back, started kind of thinking about things that really got me excited, and I refound that work and that thinking, cutting through a lot of steps. That got me onto in touch with a guy named Jim Dater at the University of Hawaii. And that was at that point where I discovered future studies. I didn't, know that it existed, but I immediately, it was like one of those epiphany moments. Okay, it's got the big picture thinking of anthropology. It's thinking about systems. It's thinking about culture. It's holistic, but it's running the take forward and saying that we're not just trying to understand and sort of explain that. We're like, how can we use that? What could we do with that information to think about, redesign, improve the world in some way? And so I really like that applied part, and that, sort of set me off the path to the University of Hawaii, studying with Jim Dater. I guess ultimately became a futurist in that way. So I'll stop there. There's a lot after that part of the story, but that's kind of the big.
I always talk about the accidental futurist. I don't think anybody comes to this, directly. I think that's always like an accidental thing that kind of, they discover it occurs,
Yeah, it's not like, lawyer or an engineer, like it lives in the margins, and you have to kind of almost, as you say, accidentally or, serendipity, find yourself to it. Oh, it exists. And then, okay, it resonates with me. So yeah, I'm one of those folks for sure.
So you mentioned the Constitution, like is that where the reconstitutional convention came from? Is that where it started from?
Yeah. So the Reconstitutional Convention was a gathering that me and others at the Institute for the Future created in 2013, so going a ways back now, with the premise that our current system, as it's designed and practiced, is not up to the task of dealing with 21st century challenges structurally. That there are fundamental failures built in to the systems that we're living under, and that electing the next right person is probably not going to solve the problem. So it's very, very much a kind of designer-led, architectural, structural approach to that. How do we redesign? In this case, we're thinking about the Constitution and mostly the U.S. Constitution, although it was a global gathering. We had satellite gatherings all around the world, but it was really to get minds across different disciplines, from constitutional law professors to designers to artists to futurists to weirdos to journalists, creatives, intellectuals.
There's actually a category. There's actually a category of weirdos. There's actually like specific classification.
That's my. I'm in Austin. It's in that one's the very cherished category, that kind of catch all for type. So we got together. We had a process that was based on more or less on Jim Dater's political system design class that he ran at the University of Hawaii, which, we can go into the details of that. But it's not just like, hey, what would we create? There's actually a fairly systematic way of thinking about it. At a fundamental level too, not just like, how can we tweak the voting system? It's really like, what are our values? What is reality? What is human nature? We take those as design parameters and then say, let's operationalize that into something that actually works. And so that was a kind of test run of that model. We have a toolkit and things that we've done, but really successful in the room, a lot of great ideas, for lots of reasons that sort of just, we kind of pushed it forward. But I would love to see, that's one of my main goals in life, is to see a kind of renaissance in political system design thinking, and get more ideas out there. I think part of our problem is a little bit of challenge of the imagination and what is possible now with new technologies. And, as you might guess, you have new scientific insights about the human mind, about self-organizing systems, about, the kind of social physics of the world, the way we communicate, our global reach. All of those things are in play. And I don't think we fully internalize or process those into ways that we can operationalize that. It's hard. And it goes back to the beginning, because the quantum politics book was great at analyzing the failures of mechanistic thinking and why we need to do that. Really operationalizing quantum physics into a political system, extremely difficult. There are very few things that were, even novel. Things like, sortition and random representation and some things, that might be interesting to do, but the challenge of operationalizing modern, difficult, complex views of reality, we're still there. And so that's sort of part of the overall goal is we need to try, and we need lots of different ways to attack that problem.
So what are the unique challenges to working with government institutions on futures projects? It's such you think of traditionally commercial business strategy.
Yeah.
Obviously, your dog has an opinion on this as well.
Zoom does a good job of like, I always apologize. Oh, I can't hear you. Okay, well, yeah, they're good there. So
it all started with the South Korean reporter for CNN when his kids walked in the back. That was just my favorite of all time. Yeah,
we're all in the same. There's no difference of existence anymore. We're all together.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, like doing projects like this is it?
No.
Yeah. So help me. Yeah. And how do you approach futures work with institutions like that?
We'll be back after a quick break.
Okay, a quick pause from the show. Are you preparing for the future or just hoping it doesn't catch you off guard? My new book, Super Shifts, is your guide to navigating the biggest transformations of our time: AI, automation, and the new world of work. And here's the deal. If you pre-order or grab your copy now, you'll get exclusive bonus content, including the behind-the-scenes look at what didn't make the final book. Stay tuned after the episode for details, but don't wait. Head to supershiftsbook.com and get your copy today. Now back to the show.
Yeah, part of that original question was unique challenges, and I don't think any of these are going to sound unique, for better or worse. I think it's a problem many with business. It's a problem with nonprofits, others that I work with. I work and teach in educational, academic institutions and governments as well. There's a lot of barriers or hurdles to get over to do good futures work. Some are cultural and some are structural. I mean, a big thing for me, as an anthropologist, you might guess that I would skew toward culture, and I do, and it's extremely important. But I think a lot about structure, and think structure matters deeply to how things are organized. So, on the cultural side, you have kind of risk aversion, cover your ass. Like I don't want to take any chances or do anything that sort of calls attention negatively to myself. So there's a lot of risk averse, fear of failure kind of stuff out there.
Yeah.
Structurally, just a lot of negative or perverse incentives to doing anything new. So are you rewarded for taking a chance? Are you rewarded if you take a chance and fail? Are you rewarded for a plan that might take 5 or 10 years to really see the fruits of? Meanwhile, your evaluation cycles, whether it's quarterly, business reports, or a 2 or 4 year election cycle, like the incentive structure to push for long-term thinking is difficult. So, you have some sort of cultural biases against pushing into the future. You have a lot of kind of structural incentive that are pushing against it. And yet things do happen, and often, unfortunately, it's you basically have to learn the hard way or get to the point where the status quo is glaringly obvious that it's not going to be sustainable and you have to try something else. So there's a lot of freedom in crisis moments, to sort of take away that the mainstream status quo normal way that we're doing things is not sustainable anyway. So we got to try something. So often we have to get to those kind of crisis points or, sort of wait a few years and then like, oh yeah, you're right. Let's actually go with that idea or go with, let's really invest in the future this time.
So it kind of bridges the conversation, because I would like to kind of get into experiential futures as well. But you did a project with Stuart Candy on the state of Hawaii, right?
Yeah.
And there were a few of them, correct? There's a 2051 you did.
Yeah, that was the kind of anchoring project or kickoff project that Stuart and I, and of course Jim Dater and others in the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies were involved in. Later on, after Stuart and I left, John Sweeney and others did 2060, and there are tendrils of that ecosystem of project that came out.
Is that where experiential Were you both like, kind of, did it come from that, or did it,
Well,
what was one more like chicken and egg? Did you guys work on other things and then use it to do the State of Hawaii project, or did the State of Hawaii project kind of called for it and it almost kind of burst experiential?
Yeah. It's a little bit of both, but in hindsight. So the project itself was kind of ex nihilo. We're like, what needs to happen here? So a little bit of background: the Hawaii 2050 project was inspired by, in many ways, the Hawaii 2000 project, which was done in 69, 70, 71 in Hawaii. And it was still to this day one of the most participatory or futures projects ever done. So the whole state of Hawaii, the main newspaper were running articles every day. There were workshops and gatherings and meetings. It was very much on people's minds. You fast forward to 2000, and some of the least desired futures for Hawaii were the ones that people were living in. So overcrowded, reliant on imports, sort of tourism driven, military driven. So kind of a fragile economy that hadn't diversified, and, this feels just like California. We've lost our sense of place. So a lot of the things that were happening in 2000 were the least preferred futures from the point of view of what people were saying in 1970. So, Stuart and I and Jim were, you take that as a challenge. Like, why did that happen? Or explain, why did we get, you did this great thing. It sort of ticked all the boxes of, really smart futurists and community engagement and government buy-in and media support and all of that. And you ended up, it didn't work. So, just trying to get real, honestly. And that was our main motivation. How do we make something like this work? And, part of our insight, again, in retrospect, it looks like, that's obvious. You were in visual anthropology. Stuart was, working in media himself, of course you would do something that's a little bit more immersive or, media rich. But no, we were it really came from that motivation. How do we make it stick? And part of our, at least, hypothesis or premise for this is making it stick means sticking it here in your gut, not just here intellectually. And, these are possibilities that can happen. No, what does it feel like? What if we could, this was also part of our logic. If you could take somebody from 1970 and time travel to 2000, this is what it feels like to live in that world. Would they have made different choices? Sort of broadly, they as a person, but also as a society. Would people have made a series of different choices along the way if they knew the outcome? They knew what it felt like to live in Hawaii they didn't want to live in 2000. So our motivation or goal or hypothesis was, if people could feel what the future might be like, maybe they'll think about things differently. And there's another thread of my work in neuroscience and neuropolitics, in the neuroscience of foresight, which, some of those insights are have become relevant. But basically, people can't make decisions without an emotional side to things. If their emotional core is disconnected from their rational side, it's almost toxic. People can't really sort of get to the point of making a decision. So we wanted to instill and install a sort of visceral, emotional feeling, embodied kind of experience of that with the premise that, maybe that would move the needle a little bit on when people are pushed to certain kind of decisions, they might choose a better path. So that was the overall premise. And we did the Hawaii 2050 event, 600 people. We created 4 radically alternative versions of the future of Hawaii using Jim Dater's alternative futures method. So, a continued high growth story, a collapse version, a post-collapse version of Hawaii, a kind of discipline or constrained version, and a high-tech transformation version. So they were really different places. I think not places maybe other than the continued growth that people, or maybe collapse too, but at least showing them alternatives. And then you process that through a conversation. Like, what are the things you liked about this one or that one, and then action steps. What could you do to make the things that you like happen, make the things you don't like not happen? So that's another critical part of this is the follow-up. This is not just an art. It's really it's a process. The art and the performance and the immersion is really a vector or doorway, an invitation to do the work, which is talk about it, process it, and then ultimately, hopefully make better decisions.
Are anything that came out of that being implemented or being used as guides? Because I know 26 has been like, they keep revisiting it, but has anything impact?
I think, well, part of it, here's another answer to your what is it like to work, challenges working with government. But we did that event with a plan to take little miniature versions of that to all the other islands, to sort of continue that process and repeat that process in smaller segmented form. But for whatever reason, I don't know if we were too successful or that, was just not, it scared people in the kind of energies that were generated and unleashed. But basically that was put aside. We were told, no, we're not going to do that again. We're going to go to high school gymnasiums and write on the board, what do you think sustainability is? And we're going to just list it on a whiteboard and then gather those and call that, a project, a process. So we were a little bit frustrated that the energy was sort of, from our point of view, I'm sure, maybe they had other reasons. It felt very political and again, risk averse, but, we saw this as a sort of momentum, a snowball effect happening, that we really didn't get to execute on. That said, the energy in the room, even though, the officialdom might have pulled back, the sort of cultural ripples, we kept hearing about stories of people, having got excited, doing, kind of, grassroots kind of work, that was going on as well. So the cultural ripples, I think, were important. Now, practically, as you mentioned, and we mentioned, 2060, a follow-up project a few years later, I think that was sort of birthed out of the unfulfilled energies that were unleashed. And in that case, I believe, in the official process of deliberating new laws in Hawaii, you have to think about future generations. I think they put, policy in place that future generations have to be considered, not in some sort of formal, environmental assessment report, but it's a little bit, symbolic, honestly, probably more than with teeth. But, start with that symbolism of even thinking about future generations as you consider new legislation, was an important outcome of the overall sort of thing that was going on.
So we've been talking about, Hawaii and the experiment, and I said the word experiential futures. We're both design futurists, which is kind of its kind of moniker. Futures is the experiential is the process. I think design futures is the practice itself, the methods. But how would you define it? It's been around for now 13 years, 15 years, 20.
Yeah.
How would you define? I know there's other done in Raby. There's other people that have different kinds of. But what?
Yeah, and these are we can get into some of the pedantry of nomenclature and who's doing what. But from our point of view as futurists, experiential futures is really trying to use rich media, immersive experiences, performance, tangible artifacts to bridge the gap. This is a phrase that my friend and colleague Stuart Candy likes to use, but basically bridging the gap between the lived present and possible futures. In a sense, to try to pre-experience or pre-live or memories of futures that haven't happened. Again, kind of touching on the neuroscience point, we tend to think about the future in terms of what we've experienced in the past. I mean, it's a natural thing to say, sort of intuitive, like, oh yeah, we imagine the future, based on what we've seen. That's our roadmap. And there's a thing that Andy Clark, cognitive philosopher, talks about, predictive processing. So we're always sort of running through simulations in our minds of the future, but those are often, and they almost always are, based on what's happening now and experiences from the past. So what we're trying to do is create artificial memories, in a sense, or artificial experiences of possible future. So they make them thinkable, they make them feelable and thinkable in that case, so that we can get out of the sort of orbit of the present that often blinds us to possibilities and see different experiences. And then, the decision-making part, installing an emotional core people, oh, that's what it feels like. Later on, you can, throw 1,000 different references to them and signals of change and all that to kind of intellectualize and fill in that gap. But having that emotional connection to I want that or I don't want that is also a kind of button or lever that we want to engage in this as well, and make sure that a kind of full bodied, full minded experience of the future is useful. And, just to sort of wrap up that the usefulness is everything for us, like our artifacts and experiences are really creative. They're fun. They sort of stand alone as an experience or, a creative endeavor. But that's not the work. And we never see that. And, that in some ways distinguishes us from maybe, how some speculative designers or, others go about, it's a little bit more about the thing. For us, it's really about the payoff in the end. What changes? What do these new experiences do to make us reconsider how we think about the future and the paths that we take?
Yeah, I think you mentioned earlier on, you talked about emotion. I think that immersion, that ability to touch, taste, feel, experience the future, it just really puts it in view versus like you get scenarios in a report, they put it in a drawer and it doesn't affect your daily life, right?
Right. And that's our enemy. Dismissal is our enemy. And that's what we've been fighting against at the beginning, is how can we be undismissible or at least fight against that I've already mentioned all the cultural and structural things. How can we fight against that where this cannot be ignored or this must be thought of? And sometimes that means scaring or, creating an emotional reaction to that, does that kind of work, at least,
is that what makes it like an experiential futures project successful? It's like the provocation, the action itself.
The reaction and the
reaction
result.
And the result.
Yeah. So for me, like if nothing changes, again, if people just have a good time or they're provoked, but it doesn't have a noticeable impact, then I wouldn't call that successful. And the tricky part is staying with these projects and finding out how, like 5 years later, that experience you had actually, the connecting the dots from that moment to a changed decision is difficult. So saying that success means something changed, positively, doesn't mean we always have that data, unfortunately. And so, we often we'll see the result or we'll see it many years later, or people even have forgotten that was, maybe one of the sources for why they shifted strategy or, changed something along the way. So it's a little bit slippery, to that, one-to-one, return on investment. Oh, you had this experiential future and then this changed. Nevertheless, that must remain our goal. This is again, in the terms of social foresight, and in service of trying to create better futures, it has to change something in my mind to be successful. It can't just be a great experience. That experience has to pay off in some positive way.
Well, you did a simulation for the CDC. It was a pandemic simulation. Like, when did you do that? When did that happen?
We did a project with a kind of arts grant from the mayor where we had and this was 2007, where one of the three scenarios that we put on the streets in a kind of guerrilla style in Chinatown. So it was an arts grant for the Chinatown district in Honolulu. Mm-hmm. And one of those three scenarios was a kind of post-pandemic world. Part of the reason why, and this is sort of the subtleties of this work, we didn't want to put stuff on the street as if a pandemic was happening. So we were cognizant of, yelling fire in a theater and, that would be
you
irresponsible.
mean you were trying to kind of display it in real space, in
Yeah, it was unannounced. It was, there were no,
that would be like War of the Worlds. That would be like, the War of the Worlds broadcast.
Orson Welles is one of the creative heroes too. So yeah, it's probably on our mind. Or like the Yes Men who do kind of satirical, provocations and things. That kind of culture jamming stuff was influential to us. So it was a post-pandemic scenario, and we did this self-directed. The Hawaii Department of Public Health and their funders, the CDC, saw what a different kind of way of communicating other than doing public service announcements like prepare or get your flu shot or whatever has very limited impact often. So they were excited about a different modality of communicating and maybe preparing people for what we all knew even back then was an eventuality. We just didn't know when it was going to happen. We knew there was going to be a global pandemic. And so they funded another stage of that sort of pandemic oriented experience, which we designed as a augmented reality game, which at the time, 2007, 2008, 2009 was very, very popular, so serious gaming and sort of role playing, World Without Oil and things were happening at the time. And so we designed a augmented reality game, which would be kind of interactive. There'd be phone calls you could make. There would be, videos that you would see that pop up and things like that. So you'd play this future and play a simulation in a more interactive way. Well, I don't know if anybody remembers this anymore for the memory hole, but swine flu happened in, I think, around March of 2009. And yeah. And, that was, for a minute going to be the big one, and people were really scared. So we had this augmented reality game around a pandemic outbreak. And meanwhile, the week we were going to launch, swine flu happened. And so we had to, the reality, for at least at that point, caught up to us. And so we redesigned the game as an emergent reality game. And we were sort of giving more practical information in real time for that. One of the things that stood out for me from that experience was, we had a kind of, in the game, a sense of how do you prioritize who gets vaccines first, which, has become quite interesting. So is it first responders? Is it, people that are out in public? Is it essential workers and things like that? So we were at that point trying to play test, how would people really react to who gets it first and when, later on the vaccine politics have emerged quite saliently over time. So that was kind of interesting and stood out in retrospect. But yeah, so, kudos to them for at least entertaining the idea of communicating in a different way that maybe would be more effective than just trying to tell people, here's a checklist, like live it. What would you do? How would you really react to that? So yeah, that was quite an interesting project. And as I said, quite interesting that reality sort of bit us as we were about to launch.
I've read a lot of dystopian fiction in my time, and like they say, you're 9 meals from anarchy.
I believe. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. In the futures world, you've got to really get out there. And you probably know this, Jim Dator's famous saying, any useful statement about the future should at first appear to be ridiculous. So if you're not really pushing out there, if things sound very conventional or kind of plausible at first glance, you're probably not doing justice to what's in store. And so you really got to push the edge to get ahead of how things are changing.
I hope that's the case with Super Shifts when it comes out in April, and I'd put a design fiction piece through the book. So the prologue is an introduction to a family in 2040, and they experience basically like the singularity, like an anomaly. But it's nobody's really talked about after the singularity, like what happens, right? So we kind of go through each super shift, each of the 9, the beginning part moves through the weeks after that. And then the epilogue goes 200 years in the future. And it is, like you said, like, it's like unbelievable, but you're like, yeah, I think I always think of data. I'm like, am I doing my job right? Like, am I doing it? Am I pushing it, the plausibility where it's like, sounds kind of, but yeah, it's kind of wild, but yeah. And then I'm like, excellent. So I totally get that. So like you've taken all of this, right? You take governance, you take experiential futures, you take your futures work, and then Institute for the Future, which is where you are right now, among your other things. But the governance lab that you run, you do, I mean, I know you through the design futures coursework you do, and we become friends over the years, but did they pitch you on it? Did you pitch that? Like, how did that come about? How did your tenure in the Institute there kind of go?
Yeah, well, we'll just keep it to the Governance Futures Lab. Now, I've been at the Institute at that point for 3-4 years, and they, the kind of organizational content business model changes over time. And at that point, in the early 2010s, this is the era of, kind of civic labs of different kinds and, skunk works and big kind of Silicon Valley experimental mode. And so the Institute was sort of playing that space as well. And I pitched, look, we need a political system design lab of some sort. Obviously, I've already gone into great detail about some of the influences on that, but we're still facing a challenge where, this was of course also after the global financial collapse. So the idea of systems failures or limitations, to say the least, were salient, and that it's going to take more than, a hero politician to solve this. And so that was the core of it. So why don't we formalize in some more direct way, a place where we can gather thinking around system design, political system design, which there weren't, mentioned Dater's class. There's bits and pieces, certainly a lot of political think tanks and things like that working on different issues. Political system design and the Governance Futures Lab is not about who's going to win the next election or even a particular kind of policy. It's really architectural, or that was the goal, kind of a renaissance of political system design. How do we become, in the sense, the kind of thinkers that were writing the Constitution to a degree? Like, how do we think about, I already mentioned, operationalizing the world we want to see, the values we want to see in the future, and doing that in a much more structural way. So that was kind of the core goal of it. And then through a whole, very, I would say, opportunistic way of thinking about how do we do that, because there weren't, we were in a way trying to make the case for that. So there weren't buckets of saying, funders who had money to throw at a particular issue because it was sort of didn't fit neatly in any of those categories. So we've since the beginning, we've been very sort of opportunistic, working with mayors or getting a little bit of funding to do the Reconstitutional Convention and things like that. So, I've enjoyed that. I've enjoyed sort of working at the margins, but I do wish that things had been accelerated sooner so that we can look at structural issues involved in our economic, environmental, cultural, political systems and get a little bit further ahead of that rather than being reactive to some of those dynamics that, I think we've seen play out over time. So yeah, that was the goal. And, again, we're still in that same, in a sense, that same mode. Where can we have a positive impact? Where can we get people thinking about things other than just what's in front of them, the crisis mode that we're all in? We really need to think about designing systems for the future. We're so caught into the present right now. No matter where you're coming from, like the present has such a deep sort of almost black hole sense of us. There's always going to be a future, I think you were saying that before, even after the singularity, there's always going to be something else after that. And so we're just trying to remind people that there's something else after that. And we should really get serious about contributing to that and just for that world too.
Well, it's the paralysis of the present. And a lot of people just, it's easy for us to talk about thinking of the futures. A lot of people can't. They just have a tough time with it. They're just so much, and it just even their lives, the stress of their day, like they don't really want to, just trying to get through the day, through the week. So it's just they could 10 years, they could care less. But even just in business, most people have, their jobs. Are they going to be there in 10 years? Like I always thought government would be more acclimated to futures work because of we'll call it the long-term managerial class that, they're always there. They're putting their 20 in and retiring, or they don't, the parties change, but they don't. Right. And to them, obviously there are political policies and agendas. And I think that's also where your governance lab comes in. It's like, how do you implement futures thinking, like, like, how do you deal with possible futures with the type of government structure? How do you deal with political systems? I think that's, Andy Hines just put out his After Capitalism book. So, it's like, what is the next kind of system? I don't think it's Star Trek's monetary system. If you've ever read the economics of Star Trek, it just doesn't work. We also we just need a hell of a lot of energy and abundance.
Right. Yeah. And experiments. Well, what you started with there was really stuck with me too, is just a little bit of, a little bit more patience and respect for people that are trying to deal with their everyday existence,
Yeah.
and to not vilify people. Oh, you should be thinking about the future. Why are you so present oriented? No, I mean, yeah, we see some of the downfalls of doing that, but you can't blame people for that. Their lives are now. We live in the now, and I've got to get by, and I've got to make sure my power stays on because it's freezing here. So you can't sort of, the sort of arrogance of thing. Why aren't you a visionary, or why aren't you thinking longer about the future, or why aren't you doing this? A lot of things are stacked against people, and just giving them the room and the patience and respect to have that, but also not stop there. You don't get to wallow in only thinking about the future, because if you're doing that, you're never going to get ahead. You're always going to sort of be fighting what's going on in front of you and never actually leading toward the future. So you got to be just a little bit more. I mean, there's modes for futures work, sometimes provocation, but sometimes it's more like a counselor or a coach or a helper that's trying to support you as you move forward. And honestly, I think experiential futures helps with that too. When you're overloaded, having a more full-bodied, you get to use different senses. You get to use different things other than your overwhelmed mind at times. And I think that's powerful for ways to sense the future when you're sort of overwhelmed by the present, which is often the case.
Yeah, my work is around, I have a approach called spectrum foresight. And I'm a big world building person. And as a designer, I look at personas. Like, there are people that exist in the world, in these whatever possible futures, there are these people. And then there's a range of experiences. I know Dater's kind of, his alternative futures take more of a, like, is it a collapse? Is it a transformational? It's like, I look at, there's people that are living in that future that it's a collapse for them.
That's right.
Or it's a transformation. You just don't, so it's like, how do each of those people, you have to address that so that when you have to plan or strategize for the future, you're addressing the needs of all the people that will live in that future. Right. So, like our government, this is being taped, a couple of days after the inauguration. It's a peaceful transfer of power, but it's also a radical change of policies from 4 years to 4 years to 4 years, no matter which administration it's in. And it's like, how, some people are like, oh my God, it's a doom scroll, or other people are like, it's just magical golden age, or just what is it in between? So all those people exist. So how do you address the needs of everybody, So I think I think for me, experiential futures is a great way to help with that, because people are just used to those things from the future. We're channeling Stewart. If you're listening, your ears are burning. And you both things of the future, like you guys are both, it's a great game. If anybody hasn't tried it, you look it up. But for me, like, where do we go? Like, where does experiential futures go the next decade? The possible futures for experiential futures, if you will. That was just so cumbersome to say. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of what are those? What does it look like for you? What's the outlook? I mean, you're kind of
I think the goals and the need has not changed. I think we still need to get out of the present. We still need to feel what different futures are like. And again, wherever you're coming from, the present is so strong right now. And it really, in some ways, keeping us from thinking about other futures. There'll be a future after Trump. There'll be a future after the next administration, And so just remembering that and knowing, and again, sort of feeling what that might be like, and keeping at least pull your eyes up every once in a while to see that horizon. It's still, so those goals are still going to be the same. The spate of technology and opportunities and places for this, I think, is really evolving. It's quite interesting. Obviously, we haven't even mentioned, we'll get thrown out of the Futures Club in an hour conversation. We didn't mention AI, but that's,
I was trying, a lot of my conversations kind of went there. I figured that might be for part 2, because I figured we could come back, you and I could come back in the summer and kind of see, like, Project Stargate just got announced, which I think, my wife and I were talking about this, like, I equivocate that to building the naval fleet in, like, pre-World War in the 30s. Like, it's like, or ramping up production, because not only is it about, like, battling in an information war or a cyber war, but it's also about instead of just like making physical things here, they have to create and figure out how to do individualized medicine, protein fold, like all the things that AI could do with super intelligence is here. And that is, again, like, yeah, well, I figured we'll get into that, but
Yeah.
and we brought it up.
So,
if there's anything you want to mention,
right.
please. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the way I see technology, and, again, this is influenced by folks like Andy Clark and extended mind theory, that we don't just think in our heads and our brains even, or we think in our bodies, obviously experiential futures, but we live in a cognitive ecology. I've got this computer in front of me, which is different than if I just had a notebook, with pen and paper. That's a different cognitive ecology.
Right.
So you add artificial intelligence into the mix, you add these generative AI, you add large language models, that changes cognitive ecology. That changes how we think, that changes how thinking is possible. So I like to think about designer futuring environments kind of holistically. And then what are the elements that go in there? So if you're thinking about the future of experiential futures, you're right, it is a mouthful. The ways that we have those experiences and the technologies and the affordances of those new cognitive ecologies to learn. I mean, for a while, everyone's like, oh, VR is that is what an immersive technology. And maybe there's still a future for that. I think it's a little more niche. But that's one way to do an experience. I really like the visceral, tangible, interactive spatial parts of doing that. So I think that'll still be part of the mix. But, adding AI, speed running through visualization, where we used to have to go to a designer and we would, sort of tweak things for days or weeks or more to come up with an artifact, that you can speed run through to get about 90% of the quality within seconds. And so you think about that, because all of this, is a designed feedback loop. As I mentioned, the bridge to the future, but you don't just stay over there. Feedback to the present. What did I learn? What can I take from this simulation that influences where I want to go? And so the speed, the cycles of those feedback loops for futuring and thinking about and immersive and experiencing futures are shrinking. So what can we do with those faster loops of learning, and how do we turn that, again, into action? So I think I'm excited about, you don't want to just sort of offload a lot of your thinking to the machine, because I think there's loss there, but using it within an ecosystem and to play that feedback loop out a little bit more richly and the speed of that, I think that's an important structural factor for that. Another part of it is where does experiential futures take place? And this, Stuart and I and many others have, consciously tried to find different locations for it, whether it's on the street of Chinatown in Honolulu, whether it's in a convention center for Hawaii 2050, whether it's in a boardroom, whether it's in a UN meeting, or working with mayors, the location, or museums. I haven't mentioned Museum of the Future as a touch point for design futures and experiential futures, but there's a whole movement out there for future oriented museums. And so the kind of public space, museums are in a sense our public memory and our public discussion of how we learn and represent ourselves to each other. So the museum space is quite interesting. So the locations of experiential futures, I think, are still in the process of expanding. And so you put those two things together, and I think you start to see maybe, in the hopeful future, that we can actually have somewhat more guidance. If not, we're not going to have certainty, but just a way to sort of play out things before we make a decision and have to learn the hard way. Again, that's another one of our enemies. Do we have to always learn the hard way? Well, maybe. I'm maybe overly hopeful, but if we can play out and see a little bit more efficiently, less cost, faster, more responsive to the moment I'm in, where that decision-making input by considering the future becomes more present to me, then I think maybe it has a bigger impact and a bigger role. And then at that point, expansion of this methodology and thinking, I think, would continue to grow quite profoundly.
Well, it also relates to, like, you and I, before we started taping, we were talking about the role of the futurist, like, and the interview Victoria Mulligan did with Paul Sappho, right, at the Defy Future Forum. And, I'm debating myself whether is it a job function, like a job role, or a like function and skill set, right?
Right.
And I think about experiential design, like the role of the designer is changing. It's not just being, and it's evolved. I think about the last 30 years of design. what you did
Mhm.
30 years ago versus 10, 20. And now, like you said, you could rapidly prototype things if you have the right prompts. And that can be scary, but it can be also liberating because you're not sitting there doing the mundane. You can really tackle more problems, bigger problems, and use the like experiential design or other
Mhm.
things to really go out because you have this space now. But use it as futurists. Where do you see the role kind of becoming more prominent and specific? Because there's so many people that call themselves, but I don't think Joe Lepore and I talked about some McDonald's. It's an actual field of study. You can't just call yourself that. But it's like, do you think it'll become
Yeah.
more skill based? Like, what do you think?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it will, and I'm not necessarily advocating that. What Sappho said was basically we don't need more futurists. But he wasn't saying we don't need more future in our world, in our lives, just as I understand. And I agree with that framing. I think we will have more futurists out there. I think people are very interested in this. I think, for lots of reasons, coming at it from, social side or governance side or technology side often. People are interested in this. The field, it's always in sort of half like, oh, is it collapsing or is it growing? But I do think it will continue to be kind of interesting and trendy in some ways, but that's fine. But really what I would prefer is if we embedded foresight into the world in a more direct way, into our systems, into our thinking, into, our technologies. A precursor to experiential futures, we were very influenced by Wendy Schultz, and she had a concept around ambient futures. Can we just make futures thinking threaded through conversations, threaded through our technologies, threaded sort of ambiently existing in the world so that we can have that interface with the future? And that was a really interesting thought. I kind of lean to that too. How can we get the future to matter in the present? And how can we make it be a difference that makes a difference to how we see the world? And so, in that sense, that's where I would, both but I would love to see even more than more futurists in the world, more futures threaded through the physical and cognitive spheres that we live in, and hopefully design those cognitive spaces, those interactive spaces to actually have a positive impact, or at least give ourselves a chance to where the future can matter to the present in some useful and important way.
I'd like it to become. Well, I'm on a kind of mission to democratize it, like design thinking was last decade. But I would like it to become a like talent-based courseware, like negotiation or difficult conversations, or project management. Like all those like masterful things you have to be I would say a complete functioning business or government, like to be, productive. And I think that in getting that mindset, it's built into it that way versus like, oh, I'm going to go off and do specialization. Like I do the futures thing when I need to, or it's over there. It's just basically within you. I think that's, it's a vision. I think we can achieve that. I think AI is going to speed up a lot of the processes in which we do things, so it becomes more easily and accessible in the way we ask and do stuff. It still requires the human element, but it again takes away the barriers to do things. So like, this amazing career you've had, and, you've done so much for the field. Like, what do you got a lot of years, ahead. I always like to, kind of ask this, like a legacy question, like, how do you want the work to be remembered? Like the impact you've had, when you're talking to your grandkids, like what you're proud of your career. Like I did this, this is great. So,
well, I mean, you don't want to get so grandiose. I mean, I would love to just see better livable worlds, for my kids now, but whatever pain and transformation we're going through now, I want to come out on the other end where, it's just kind of back to the question, how do we want to live as humans? I mean, this is something from the very start that's been influenced by me. We are rubbing up against, crisis. We're in the crisis because I don't think anybody's happy with the way they're living, or not enough. They're sort of agitated and dissatisfied for whatever reason. So I would love to contribute to a world where we have an honest conversation, and not as if it's some sort of monolithic thing. There are different ways to live, but where people can ask serious questions about how do we want to live, and then we have a way to design that, the way to contribute to that. That's where my sort of democracy hat comes in. Is like, can we create systems where people can have an influence on the kind of outcomes they want, and maybe steer toward living in worlds that they actually enjoy living in, and feel a little bit of agency toward getting there in some ways. So that's kind of the big grandiose goal of it. And in another sense, like, just just having a positive impact at very local levels. I teach. I've seen people who have not heard of future studies. This is not a precise number, but I find that when I'm teaching classes, about 10 to 15% of people that take the class, it's a life-changing thing. They didn't know it existed. It really
How do they find it? How do they just choose for that?
Well, it could be a class, that they take that they didn't realize that it was futures, or it's just part of a curriculum. Like I used to teach at California College of the Arts, and they had a strategic foresight class within their design strategy MBA program. So it was an elective. So somebody would take it, this might be interesting. Or, at UT, I teach experiential futures to a combo med school, design school program in design. So, it's an elective. So, they must already be interested at some level, but often they don't really know what they're taking. The first parts of the class are always like disabusing of what you think it is, trying to tell you what it is. Everybody gets something out of it, I hope. But I really found that there's a good percentage of students are like, oh my God, yeah, I needed this. I didn't realize it. It's going to change how I do. And I've had students who've gone off and become futurists, and that weren't even, that wasn't their intention ever. They weren't already coming into the room thinking they would do that. Just like we all did, the accidental futurists is kind of in that sense. So having those sort of maybe life improving or life altering impacts on a one-to-one student human, at a workshop, somebody hears about something that positively changes them, or that opens a doorway to a kind of career or life that they didn't see. So at that level too, I hope, to have had, when the story is told, some positive impacts there.
That's great. So where can people find you and learn more about, obviously you have a lot of stuff on ResearchNet or, ResearchGate or but where can people find you?
Well, there's a little Christmas bar down the road, a year-round Christmas bar. You can find me there in Austin.
Excellent. Excellent.
Otherwise, yes, I have a website, jakedunagan.com. Go there with all caveats that haven't been updated in a long time, but you can get something there. I've sort of pulled back from social media, but I'm sort of remain a minor present on Blue Sky, Dunagan 23 at Blue Sky. And then, I'm at the Institute, so you can reach out to me there directly. Never popular enough to be flooded with people, so I that means I can keep an open door. We'll see if that changed, but I'm always keen to talk to people and see where they're at and see how futures can be useful, or I can help in some way.
It's great. And the most important question of all of it, what's your favorite taco and your barbecue spot in Austin? People want to know. People want to know these things. These are important things.
Yeah. Almost any gas station is going to have pretty good tacos. So I'm not going to pick a chain. Just
gas station tacos, not gas station sushi, but gas station tacos.
Different. Not in Austin. I've lived in Honolulu. I've had some gas station sushi. It's pretty darn good.
Interesting.
But,
okay.
Right. Well, my favorite barbecue, Franklin's is actually good. That's the big.
If you can stand in line, it absolutely.
No, I'm never going to stand in line, but if it crosses my path, it's pretty good. But I love this food truck on South Elmore called Brown's Barbecue. Nice. I like brisket, but I also like pork barbecue. So sometimes I skew toward places that can do pork barbecue. So Brown's Barbecue, it's a truck.
Nice.
On South Elmore. So that's a good one that maybe people hadn't heard of.
Awesome. Well, Jake, we're going to do part 2, I'm sure, soon. This is great. Thanks for being on. And we'll talk.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah. If part 2 is in 6 months, the world will be completely different. So.
Exactly. That's the whole thing. So
cool. We can process together. It's a day by day story.
Exactly.
But yeah, just have me enjoy the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Think Forward podcast. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms and at www.thinkforwardshow.com, as well as on YouTube under Think Forward Show. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to the show. Now, about that thing I mentioned earlier about the book Super Shifts. Imagine having a playbook to navigate what's coming next. That's exactly why I wrote Super Shifts, to help you understand and prepare for the seismic changes shaping our world. Don't just react. Get ahead. Super Shifts is available now, wherever you get your books. And if you order today, you'll get exclusive bonus content. Head to supershiftsbook.com and grab your copy now and start future-proofing your life. The future won't wait. Why should you?